Kia ora from New Zealand, and thanks for inviting me to speak at your conference. And I do apologise for this being a recording, but unfortunately it is the middle of the night in New Zealand, and so unable to be with you in person, so to speak. New Zealand, Aotearoa, also known as the land of the long white cloud, has a population of 5 million and is a close neighbour to Australia. New Zealand is the same size as the United Kingdom, yet has 1/14 of its population. Our national icon is the kiwi, a flightless bird, and you may have seen many views of New Zealand through the films of The Lord of the Rings. On September the 4th, 2010, a large earthquake hit the largest city in the South Island of New Zealand. Measuring 7.1 on the Richter scale and 10 metres deep, it was a major shock for New Zealand, who thought Wellington, the capital, would be considered the most likely to suffer from a large seismic event. The earthquake hit at 4:35 a.m. in the morning, taking out power, water and sewerage. The unearthly silence that ensued, exacerbated by the early morning, was evident citywide. Christchurch City is built upon a swamp, so liquefaction was extensive. Liquefaction occurs when a partially saturated soil loses strength and stiffness in response to applied stress, such as in an earthquake. It produces a fluid-like mud mass. On top of this were the aftershocks. More aftershocks, but wait, even more. There was large-scale damage to land, buildings and infrastructure, but luckily no loss of life. Flooding of streets and houses was widespread. Broken sewage pipes also added danger. Most of the buildings in Christchurch were made of brick or masonry. Stone buildings were also deeply affected. Many buildings were made of unsupported brick, and this significantly failed in the September earthquake. With bricks and parapets falling from the sky, anything beneath was severely damaged. Churches in particular were severely affected. A state of emergency was issued by the government, giving them absolute power. Civil defence were called up, and the military, police and other emergency services went into action. So the salvage began. Buildings were shored up and debris was removed. Affected areas were cordoned off from the general public. Some efforts did appear to be somewhat underwhelming. In the first case study, a small provincial museum of local social history was given no prior notice that their building was to be demolished, with their collections still inside. They only discovered this through one of the councillors. They had no supplies for salvage, and the volunteers also had to cope with their own homes and families. Issues pertaining to the salvage of their collection included their own personal safety, lack of priority by the council of their small museum, and stress and lack of time. The collection had to be salvaged as the demolition of the building was in progress. However, as this was a small tight-knit community, the town rallied around and worked together to save what they could. Many volunteers turned up with vital supplies such as storage and packing materials. Whole display cases with collections within were moved in situ due to lack of time and the speed of which the demolition was taking place. They were removed to a container that was placed on the road outside to protect the collection once it was out of the building. Issues relating to the salvage included a lack of help from the authorities, as not seen to be a priority at the time. There was no disaster plan, no risk mitigation in place, and no inventory of the collection. However, the salvage was very well organised, and team members knew what they had to do and were allocated tasks, due mainly to having trained on past workshops from the Canterbury disaster team and from being a very tight-knit community. A considerable amount of archival material was given by large institutions such as the National Library of New Zealand, the National Archives of New Zealand and Te Papa, and other big institutions around the country. However, these soon ran out and were patently not enough. On February the 22nd at 12:51 p.m. 2011, a large aftershock of 6.3 hit at a shallow depth of 5 metres. It occurred near the Port Hills of Lyttelton, 10 kilometres from Christchurch central city. The shock reverberated along the Port Hills into central Christchurch, causing mass destruction. The damage of the September 2010 earthquake paled into insignificance compared to the loss of life and destruction caused by this aftershock. Rockfall was significant, particularly in the suburbs of Sumner. The centre of Christchurch became a red zone where few were allowed to go. Buildings were decimated and people's lives were destroyed. Christchurch became a ghost town. Large-scale buildings that had survived virtually intact in the September quake were destroyed or severely damaged in this February aftershock. Modern buildings were impacted by this aftershock, leading to the loss of 185 lives, most in 2 buildings of a 1970s-80s design. Many church buildings that had been compromised in the first earthquake were now completely destroyed. Weatherboard buildings that had stood up quite well in the first earthquake were actually severely damaged in this aftershock. Many of the buildings that survived were deemed to be irreparable, and in the case of historic buildings, eventually 231 were demolished after the earthquakes. During the first few months, Christchurch citizens worked together, supporting each other and helping out whenever necessary. New Zealand does have a can-do attitude, and this really helped in the event of this disaster. The second case study, relating to a significant heritage collection after the February 2011 quake, was an archive collection in the red zone of the Christchurch city centre. 9 months after the building had been evacuated, we were allowed to enter to salvage the collection. There were a few issues. The collection was on the 8th floor and there was no power and no lift. Therefore, it was decided to lift a series of containers to the 8th floor window so that the collection could be salvaged quickly and safely without using the stairs or the darkened corridors. Despite having a great deal of archival materials and boxes, they were quickly used up. Therefore, as a temporary measure, waxed boxes were used to replace them. Eventually, time became so tight that any means was used to try and get the archives out. There was a set timetable because the building was due to be demolished. In the third case study, an art gallery in the centre of Christchurch had to contend with some unique challenges. Although much of the damages at the art gallery were minor compared to other cultural heritage collections, there were some failings. The cleats on some of the large paintings failed, leading to artworks falling from the racks. Much of our storage was either crated or boxed, and this proved to be a boon as many of them fell over, although very little was damaged as the crates and boxes protected the artworks within. Some displays were affected, particularly those of modern materials which had been installed by the artists themselves. The ceiling tiles that were in all the exhibition areas fell onto displays, luckily with little damage, as most were in display cases or glazed. By far the biggest issue was the invasion of the art gallery by the Civil Defence Forces. Unbeknown to the gallery staff, the building had been allocated as a civil defence hub in the event of a disaster by the local government. The Civil Defence appeared with no notice and took over gallery spaces with artwork still in place. Luckily, security staff were able to lock off the more fragile exhibitions. The gallery staff lost control of some of the gallery spaces, and it took some time and negotiation to remove the art from the walls. However, many lessons were learned from the experience, and in some cases, some of our preparation proved to be very successful. The biggest key to all the salvages was the need to work together as a team. This proved vital in all of the salvages that we undertook. The Canterbury Disaster Team undertakes an annual workshop for training in all forms of disaster preparedness. This proved to be vital to enable the small institutions to recover after the earthquakes. So who are the Canterbury Disaster Team? It was a group that was set up in 1987 from volunteers from all the major institutions in the Canterbury region, and most of the team members represent their institutions and are able to participate in the team due to the goodwill of their employer. Our guiding philosophy is to be well prepared for any type of disaster, and our mission is to provide training and advice to those in the Canterbury region who need to care for their maintenance of heritage collections. Our objectives relate directly around education, dissemination of information and training. We also have a website which we put all our newsletters and information onto for the use of anybody. The team is made up of a wide variety of specialists in cultural heritage. We also produce a quarterly newsletter for all the participants in our workshop. The news group is made up of over 200 cultural institutions, including museums, galleries, historical societies, archives and libraries. There was one museum that was sterling in its help of all the other cultural institutions in the Canterbury region. The Royal Air Force Museum in Wigram helped in salvaging collections from many, many smaller museums. As they also had large storage areas, they took in collections from other small galleries, museums and archives so that they could safeguard them until their buildings were sorted out. They also obtained funds from the government to build a recovery centre for the small museums to enable them to look after inventory and generally restore their collections while they were waiting for their buildings to be repaired. Lessons learned? There were many, but mainly prevention makes your life a whole lot easier should the worst occur. Ensure the building you are in protects the people in collection. Many small museums found this was not the case. Train for the worst. People, were the right decisions being made? And how effective was it? Thank you for listening, and should you have any questions, I will be quite happy to answer them if you email me at lynnpamelac325@gmail.com. Kia kaha. I would also like to dedicate this talk to the 185 people who lost their lives in the February quake and the first responders who put their lives on the line to save others.